Some hauntings don't come with blood. They don't scream from the walls or show themselves in mirrors. Some hauntings creep in like mold. They settle in. They rot a place from the inside out. It starts with a knock, a flicker, a sound you swear you heard, but no one else did. That's how it began for the Smurl family. A devout Catholic family living in a quiet duplex in Pennsylvania. They weren't looking for a story. They didn't want attention. And for years, they said nothing. But when the entity in their home grew stronger, when it began to touch them, hurt them, whisper to them at night, they realized they were in the middle of something they couldn't pray their way out of. This is not a movie. This is not fiction. This is a haunting that lasted over a decade. And by the end, they believed it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a spirit. It was a demon. This is Creep Canvas, and I'm your host, The Creep. Tonight, we travel to West Pittston, Pennsylvania, to a modest brick duplex on Chase Street. It looked ordinary. 2 units, 2 families, 1 unseen occupant. This is the story of Jack and Janet Smurl, their children, and the force that invaded every corner of their home. It wasn't just noises. It wasn't just cold spots. They claimed it touched them, scratched them, sexually assaulted them. It split the family emotionally. It drew in demonologists. It pushed priests and skeptics alike to their limits. And still, it was never truly explained. There was no exorcism that ended it all. No neat wrap-up. Just a family who moved away and stayed quiet. Some say they made it up. Some say they wanted a book deal. But if you believe what they said, if even part of it is true, then the scariest part isn't that a demon lived in their house. It's that they lived with it for over 13 years. And no one could help. In this episode, we'll walk through the full case. From the day they moved in, to the moment they realized they were not alone. We'll hear the voices, feel the cold spots. We'll listen to the tape recordings, and we'll meet the only people who ever claimed to face it head on. Ed and Lorraine Warren. So turn the lights down, put the phone away, and listen closely. Because this haunting doesn't knock once. It waits. It watches. And then it moves in. In 1973, Jack and Janet Smurl were looking for a fresh start. They weren't rich. They weren't flashy. They were a quiet, middle-class couple trying to build a stable life for their family in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, a sleepy river town between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. Jack had recently returned to health after undergoing heart surgery. Janet was holding the family together, juggling motherhood and caregiving. They had 2 young daughters, Dawn and Heather. Janet was also pregnant with twin girls, Shannon and Karen. Life was busy, chaotic, but filled with hope. So when a modest brick duplex on Chase Street came up for sale, they saw it as the perfect opportunity. One side of the home would be for them and their children. The other side would be for Jack's elderly parents, John and Mary. 2 generations, one roof. A close-knit Catholic family living together. It seemed ideal. The first few months passed quietly. Then came the pipes. No matter how often Jack tightened them, the bathroom pipes banged at odd hours, sometimes right before dawn. He'd fix them, only to have them loosen again. No water leaks, no visible calls. He chalked it up to old plumbing, an inconvenience and nothing more. Next, it was the stains. Brown, greasy splotches on the ceiling began to appear, especially in the kitchen and living room. Janet would scrub them clean, only to find them again the next morning, always in the same places. Then came the sounds. Footsteps on the stairs, doors creaking open, the sound of the back screen door slamming shut when everyone was inside. Jack started staying up later. Janet began locking every door, every night, double-checking the windows, even though she didn't know why. She began to feel like they were being watched. One night, while folding laundry in the living room, Janet heard whispering. Just a few words, low, murmured. She couldn't make them out. She walked into the kitchen. Nothing. Then into the dining room. Still nothing. She thought it was the TV in the other room. Only the TV wasn't on. And she was alone. That night, she didn't mention it to Jack. Not yet. Over time, the small things became a pattern. The family dog, Simon, began to bark at the walls. Sometimes he'd sit for hours at the foot of the stairs, growling at the dark hallway, tail stiff, hackles raised. The twins, just toddlers, began crying in their cribs for no reason. They pointed to corners of the room. One of them even said, "The black thing is in there," while pointing to the closet. Still, Janet and Jack weren't ready to say it. Not out loud. They were religious, rational, private people. They didn't want to admit something could be wrong. Not in their home. But late at night, lying awake in bed, Janet found herself praying harder than ever. And Jack, a man not easily frightened, had started to leave the hallway light on, just in case. They thought they were imagining it. They hoped it would stop. But it hadn't even begun. By 1975, the Smurls had been living in the house for 2 years. And the disturbances weren't just strange anymore. They were personal. It was like something in the house had learned who they were, their patterns, their fears, their weak points, and was beginning to test just how far it could go. It wasn't just whispers in the night or cold air near a vent. Now it touched them. Now it scratched. One of the earliest moments that truly shook Janet happened late one night while Jack was working overtime. The children were asleep. The house was quiet. She was folding towels in the upstairs hallway, just outside the bathroom, when she heard footsteps on the floorboards behind her. One step, then another. Then it stopped. She turned quickly, expecting to see one of the girls, but no one was there. She walked to their bedroom. Both twins were fast asleep. Heather and Dawn, too. Janet stood in the hallway for a full minute, listening. And then, the light bulb above her flickered. Once, twice, then died. She ran downstairs and left the laundry for morning. Over time, the Smurls began experiencing what they called unseen contact. Jack described lying in bed at night and feeling something brush against his feet, gently at first, then with force. One evening, while watching TV with his father, a cold gust of air swept through the living room, despite all the windows being shut. The room dropped 10 degrees in seconds. That night, Jack woke up to find deep scratches down his chest. He thought maybe he'd done it in his sleep, but his nails were clean, and the marks were too deliberate, too even. Then the shadows came. It started as a shape in the corner, a tall, black silhouette that looked like something standing completely still, watching. Janet saw it first, in the corner of the twins' room while she was changing the sheets. She turned around, and it vanished. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, until she saw it again, and again. Always in the corner. Always gone the moment she looked straight at it. One night, Heather woke up screaming. She said the tall man with no face was sitting in the rocking chair across from her bed. The chair was still rocking when Janet ran in. At this point, the Smurls were exhausted. Janet was having trouble sleeping. Jack was withdrawn. The children began acting out, fighting more, crying often. And then the smell came. Multiple times, the family reported a vile, rotting odor that would appear suddenly and vanish just as fast. It smelled like sulfur, or rotten meat, or something dead in the walls. They called pest control. They checked the basement. Nothing. The smell would appear in the girls' bedrooms, sometimes in the hallway, and once in the middle of dinner. They would lose their appetite instantly. Jack once said the smell was so thick, it felt like it clung to his skin for hours. One evening, Janet had just finished brushing her hair. She turned away from the bathroom mirror to grab her robe, and the mirror ripped from the wall and shattered on the floor. No one was near it. The hooks were still intact. That night, Jack was pulled from sleep by the sound of a woman crying, softly, almost behind the wall. but when he pressed his ear against the plaster, the crying stopped. They began to feel it in their bones, like an illness, a low, chronic tension that sat in the walls and seeped into their skin. Even Jack's parents, John and Mary, living on the other side of the duplex, had started to notice strange things. Mary once reported that the TV kept changing channels on its own, or that she'd hear knocking on the wall between the units, but no one was there. Janet started fainting from stress. Jack was grinding his teeth in his sleep. The girls refused to sleep with the lights off. And still, they said nothing to anyone. Who would believe them? They hadn't seen a ghost. They had no photos, no proof. Just scars, voices, and the growing certainty that something was in their house. By 1980, the Smurl Haunting had transformed. What once seemed like a playful poltergeist, knocking, moving objects, flickering lights, had turned cruel, intentional, violent. This wasn't a presence in the house. It was a predator, and the Smurls were its prey. The most horrifying phase began with Jack. He started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his body heavy with something he couldn't explain. At first, he thought it was a bad dream, a side effect of stress or sleep paralysis. But one night, he awoke pinned to the bed, arms locked, chest heavy. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. And then, something climbed on top of him. He described it later as a black mass, cold, foul-smelling, and deliberate. It didn't hurt him at first. It just watched. It hovered. And then it began to move. Jack claimed he was sexually assaulted by this force, not once, but multiple times. And the next morning, he would wake up bruised, gasping for air, sheets soaked in sweat. He told Janet. She believed him, because she'd felt it too. For Janet, the contact was subtler, but no less disturbing. She would be standing at the sink when she felt fingertips on her back. She'd spin around, expecting one of the girls, but no one was there. One morning, she awoke to find handprints on her thighs, large, bruised, and not Jack's. And then there were the whispers. They came at night, just as she drifted off. A voice so close, she could feel the breath on her ear, speaking words she couldn't understand. Sometimes in English, sometimes in something else. Once, the voice said, "You can't stop me." The energy in the home changed. Lights would surge and burst. The TV would explode into static and sparks. Doors slammed themselves shut. The smell of sulfur returned, stronger, more persistent. In one terrifying moment, the kitchen caught fire. Flames erupted from a socket, even though no appliances were plugged in. Jack grabbed the extinguisher and put it out. An electrician inspected the home. No cause could be found. This wasn't just haunting anymore. This was a campaign. Something was targeting the family, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. And now, it was pushing them apart. Jack grew more withdrawn. He was once optimistic, steady, the protector. But now he was short-tempered, quiet. He'd sit on the couch for hours, staring at the wall. He began missing work, sleeping during the day, and avoiding church. Janet tried to hold it all together. She kept the home clean, took the girls to school, cooked, but she was unraveling. Her hair began falling out in clumps. She developed severe migraines. One day, she collapsed while folding laundry and had to be taken to the hospital. Doctors found nothing wrong. They called it stress. She called it something else. Even the children weren't spared. Dawn and Heather began seeing a figure at the foot of their bed. A man-shaped shadow that stood silently, watching. The twins, still very young, started waking up screaming. One of them wet the bed. The other began drawing pictures of the man with no mouth. Their grades slipped. They stopped having friends over. They grew quiet, fearful, and older than their years. And then, one night, the girls' room filled with a sound that could only be described as screaming from inside the walls. All 4 children heard it. So did Janet and Jack. It lasted less than a minute, and then complete silence. At this point, the Smurls didn't care about proof. They didn't want to, quote, catch it on camera. They weren't worried about what people might say. They wanted it gone. They prayed harder, hung crosses, blessed the house with holy water, but none of it worked. If anything, it got angrier. And when the knocking stopped, the voices grew louder. When the bruises healed, new ones appeared. And when Jack finally reached out to the church for help, he was told to wait. By 1986, Jack and Janet Smurl had tried everything they knew. They'd spoken with priests. They'd prayed as a family. They'd blessed the home themselves. They'd even tried ignoring it, hoping the thing would get bored on its own and move on. But it didn't. It got stronger, bolder, meaner, and they were running out of hope. So they reached out to the only people they thought might truly believe them, and more importantly, might actually help: Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed and Lorraine Warren were no strangers to darkness. They'd investigated the Amityville Horror, the Annabelle doll, and countless other alleged possessions and hauntings across the country. To some, they were heroes, warriors of faith battling unseen forces. To others, they were frauds, peddlers of sensationalism. But the Smurls didn't care about reputation. They didn't care about skeptics. They were desperate. And when the Warrens arrived in West Pittston, they brought with them a quiet certainty. If the devil was in the house, they would find it. The moment Lorraine stepped inside the duplex, she said she could feel it. There was a heaviness, she said later. A spiritual weight hanging in the air, the kind you don't forget. She walked the house slowly, room by room. No cameras, no meters, just intuition. She paused in the girl's bedroom, in the bathroom, in the hallway upstairs. She said she saw shadows curling into corners, hiding behind doors, shrinking away from light. And when she reached the master bedroom, she stopped, frozen. "It's here," she whispered. "It's been here for a long time." While Lorraine explored physically, Ed worked methodically. He interviewed the family, separately and together, cross-referenced details, and asked hard questions. He looked at photos of bruises, inspected broken crucifixes, collected tapes of unexplained sounds and voices recorded in the house. He later told the press, this wasn't a ghost. This was a demonic infestation in full bloom. He noted 3 phases. Infestation, the initial disturbances. Oppression, the physical and mental toll. And possession, when the entity takes control. Ed believed the Smurls were already in phase 2 and closing in on 3. On one of their visits, the Warrens attempted to capture EVP, electronic voice phenomena, by leaving a tape recorder running in the living room overnight. What they claimed to hear on playback was disturbing. They said the tape captured a deep growling voice, muffled cries, and a distorted phrase spoken in what sounded like Latin, followed by English. "You're mine. They are mine." They later played this tape for a priest, who reportedly refused to return to the house afterward. Ed and Lorraine called in clergy to perform informal blessings. Candles were lit, prayers spoken in every room, holy water sprinkled across beds, doorways, and windows. But the activity didn't stop. In fact, it escalated. The next night, a crucifix was ripped off the wall in the hallway. The girls reported hearing something snarling under their beds. Janet was pushed against a door so hard she fractured her shoulder. And in one terrifying moment, while Jack sat alone at the kitchen table, he claimed to see a black mass rise from the floor and take the shape of a man. It didn't have a face, he said, just rage. You could feel the rage coming off of it. Eventually, the Warrens convinced a local priest to perform a minor rite of exorcism. This wasn't a full Vatican-approved exorcism. It was more of a spiritual blessing, meant to push back whatever force was present. But after the rite, the house fell into an eerie silence. No footsteps, no whispers, no growls. For 3 days, nothing. And then everything returned. Stronger, faster, louder. Jack was scratched. One of the girls was levitated off of her bed, and Janet woke up one night with her pillow over her face, unable to breathe. The entity wasn't just holding on, it was fighting back. And as the Smurls neared total collapse, they realized the church wasn't ready to help. And that left them completely alone. By the summer of 1986, the Smurls were no longer just a family under siege. They were now a headline, a curiosity, a tabloid ghost story, a haunted house on the evening news. Their suffering had gone public, and instead of relief, it only made things worse. Once the Warrens went public with their findings, the story exploded. Newspapers in Pennsylvania picked it up first, then regional stations, then national television. Reporters descended on the duplex on Chase Street, knocking on doors, filming the exterior, shouting questions through windows. They wanted photos, EVP recordings, proof. And when they didn't get it, they turned on the family. Neighbors complained. Some moved. Others accused the Smurls of making the whole thing up. The once quiet duplex became a circus, and the family, already at their breaking point, began to fracture under the weight of public attention. Jack and Janet were exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and mentally. Jack's sleep became erratic. He would stay up most of the night, sitting in the kitchen with the lights on, gripping a Bible. Janet developed what doctors later described as stress-induced seizures. She fainted at the grocery store. Her hair continued to thin, and she lost over 20 pounds in less than 3 months. The girls were quieter now, withdrawn. They didn't want to play with friends. They didn't talk about school. Sometimes they would fall asleep in the living room together, mattresses on the floor, just so no one had to be alone. Jack had reached out to the Diocese of Scranton multiple times. So had Ed and Lorraine Warren. They requested a formal Vatican-approved exorcism, the highest rite recognized by the Catholic Church. But their pleas were met with silence. Church officials later said they had found no evidence of supernatural activity and had performed no formal investigation. Jack was devastated. He was a man of faith. He believed, not in ghosts, but in the power of God to cast out darkness. Now, even the church had abandoned him. Skeptics came out in force. Some said the Smurls were delusional. Others said the Warrens had put the idea in their heads. A few even accused the family of fabricating the entire story for profit. But the truth? The Smurls had never sold the movie rights. They hadn't pursued a book deal at this point. They hadn't asked for $1. They weren't chasing fame. They were trying to survive. When a local journalist asked Jack what he wanted. His reply was quiet, measured. I want my house back. I want my children to sleep. I want it to be quiet again. With no help from the church, the Smurls resorted to a final private exorcism organized by the Warrens and a sympathetic priest. Under the radar, away from the press. This rite was more intense than anything before. The priest walked room to room, chanting in Latin, sprinkling holy water, pressing a crucifix into walls that had once bled from the seams. The family stood in the center of the living room, hands linked, heads bowed. And for a moment, just one, there was silence. Real silence. No wind, no creaking pipes, no growls, just peace. It lasted 3 days. Then the knocking returned. Then the screams in the walls. Then the shadow that moved across the kitchen floor and vanished into the hallway. That was it. 13 years of living in fear, of being disbelieved, of watching their children suffer. In 1987, the Smurls left. They moved to Wilkes-Barre, a nearby town. A new house, a clean slate, and whatever had stalked them did not follow. The Smurls left the house in 1987, and just like that, the activity stopped. No more whispers, no shadows on the walls, no growling from behind the bedroom door, no smells, no scratches, no screams in the dark. They moved to Wilkes-Barre, just 20 minutes down the road, to a small rental. Plain, quiet. And there, they found peace. A few years later, Jack and Janet finally told their full story publicly in the 1988 book, The Haunted, One Family's Nightmare. They co-authored it with Ed and Lorraine Warren and a writer named Robert Curran. It chronicled everything, from the moment they moved into the duplex to the last desperate blessing and everything in between. The book was a modest success. No bestseller, no blockbuster movie. But in 1991, it was adapted into a made-for-TV movie. Janet watched it once, then never again. It wasn't about entertainment, she said. It was about making sure people knew we weren't crazy. The Smurl Haunting divided people. It still does. Some believe it was one of the most extreme cases of demonic oppression in American history. Others believe it was a tragic psychological spiral brought on by stress, illness, and deeply held religious beliefs. Skeptics point to a lack of physical evidence, no church-acknowledged exorcism, the involvement of the Warrens, who themselves were the subject of heavy criticism in later years. But no one ever proved the Smurls were lying. No one ever caught them in a contradiction. No one ever showed evidence of a hoax. Jack and Janet passed polygraph tests. They never tried to monetize the story beyond the book. And when the attention died down, they disappeared from the spotlight. The duplex on Chase Street still stands. New families have lived there. Some say they felt nothing, no spirits, no voices, no bad dreams. Others say the place still feels wrong. There are rumors, still, that the basement is always cold, that lights flicker, that cats won't go upstairs. But no one has reported a case as violent or sustained as what the Smurls endured, which raises a question. Was the house haunted, or was the family the target all along? Maybe this story isn't about demons, or ghosts, or Catholic rites. Maybe it's about how little we truly understand about fear, belief, and the human mind. Because whether you believe the Smurls or not, there's no denying that something happened in that home. They changed, they suffered, and they stood by their story until the end. Not for attention, not for money, but because they wanted to be believed. I don't know what the Smurls saw. I don't know what they heard. I don't know what it felt like to be afraid, to close your eyes in your own bed, or to watch your children sleep, wondering if something would come for them in the night. But I do know this. Sometimes, the scariest thing about a haunting isn't the entity. It's the possibility that it could happen to anyone. To a family like yours, to a couple like Jack and Janet, in a neighborhood like yours, in a house that looks just like yours. No blood on the walls, no final confrontation, just years of slow unraveling, invisible teeth, and silence. You've been listening to Creep Canvas, and I'm the Creep. If this episode gave you chills, share it, leave a review. And if you've experienced something you can't explain, leave it in the comments. We want to hear your story. Until next time, lock your doors, say your prayers, and remember, sometimes the house isn't haunted, the people are.